Thank you, and I'll do my best here. I was looking forward to seeing Urvashi here this morning, and oh, she is here. Oh, good. But maybe we'll see. Maybe she'll step in before this goes on. I guess we should begin anyway. So we do have these five who are here to talk about this, the relationships of South to South, and I'm coming from the North, so I'm going to be learning a lot. First, we'll just go in order here and have everyone talk a little about their view of this South to South exchange, and certainly South Asia, because of being here, is most relevant. But I would think this could also include Africa, Latin America, other aspects of the South. But again, there's a lot going on here, and we are here. So Terri-ann, begin with you.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm just going to speak very briefly to say that officially, in a formal sense, it took us a very long time to announce that we were part of Asia in Australia. So, we're catching up fast, and it's fantastic to be in India at a writers' festival and a book fair to try and determine how we might make connections. But I'd suggest that we're all in a very early stage of doing this, and there is so much potential because of these similarities that we have between our cultures, and because South Asian writing has been such a central part of the reading lives of people right across the globe, but certainly in Australia for many decades. So I guess one of the challenges is finding other Indian languages as well to step into, translate, and to broaden out that world that we understand of Indian literature.
Hi, I'm Meredith Curnow from Random House, and just adding to what Terri-ann said about Australia taking a while to recognise it was part of Asia, one of the interesting things, the Penguin and Random House merging, though we operate separately in Australia and very competitively in Australia as well. But one of the things that has happened is that we're now called Penguin Random House APAC, Asia Pacific, which is new for us because, of course, we were always so connected to the UK. We reported through the UK. And so that's an interesting thing, that we're being formally, by our structure, encouraged to work with Asia, which of course is something that we're incredibly keen to do. On my personal Knopf Random House list, it's actually Alfred A. Knopf's 100th birthday today, interestingly. But on my list, the majority of it is Australian generated, edited and published in Australia, but I also buy in books from the UK and the US, and have done Indonesian translations, published an Indonesian writer, and most recently French. So I would love to get Indian writers on my list, because Australia, of course, is a country with a great Indian population, a love of India. Australians have always travelled to India very early in their life and retained that connection. So I would love to get some Indian writers on my list, and love to see more Australian writers published in India as well. But just following on from Shona talking about the film tie-in, which is massive in Australia, even if the film is a dog, such as Peter Jackson's film of Lovely Bones, the Alice Sebold, more people bought the film tie-in edition of the book in Australia than saw the film. So it's a really interesting thing. But I was wondering if Bollywood works on the same thing, if you have film tie-ins of Bollywood novels, and perhaps that's a way we could start to publish Indian novels in Australia, because there's all that marketing money and things, and just kind of making more connections.
Thanks. I'm Wendy Weir. One of the things that wasn't mentioned in my bio is that I'm currently part of the executive team at the Australia Council for the Arts. So we are a government agency. We're not of the government, but we're funded by it, and we put about 200 million US into the Australian landscape through arts funding across art forms. So one of the benefits that I have is that because we have that bird's eye view of what people are applying for funding for, and we also have a very well-developed research department, we have a really good perspective of what the trends are happening in Australian arts generally, but also, of course, in literature as part of that. So we've recently done a big audit of what's happened internationally over the last 5 years in the Australian arts landscape, and we've discovered that there has been a really distinct shift in trends from what we would think of as traditional markets like North America and Europe, Western Europe in particular, towards Asian markets. So the increase over the last 4 years has been a shift of 86%, which is where in the rise in applications. So that's a pretty good indicator of where the Australian mindset is heading when it comes to thinking about how we interact with our neighbours. I think it's very much about a neighbourhood kind of ideal, where we see that now Australians are much more interested in engaging with South Asia and Asia generally. And we're looking at it from a platform not of outbound pushing market development, but we're looking at it from very much a perspective of reciprocity, exchange, collaboration, artist-to-artist connections, those sorts of things where we find enormous success. So in India in particular, we've found that engagement has been very much led by literature and the visual arts. So those are the two art forms where we find there's that really strong sense of eagerness to connect and share and develop. So it's a pretty interesting space that we're in at the moment, hence this clutch of Australians at this event.
I'm David Ryding. I run the City of Literature office in Melbourne, and I'm just going to briefly talk about what a City of Literature is, just so if you have any misconceptions or curiosity about it. I can speak a lot about it and probably take up a whole hour, so if you want to talk to me later. The Creative Cities is a UNESCO initiative to make sure culture is central to a city's development and sustainable development, and there's 6 creative city types. There's design, film, I always forget some gastronomy, is it film? Folk art and literature. I've probably forgotten one, but that's okay, they're not here. And so there's 11 cities of literature. I'm not going to list them all, but Melbourne's obviously one. And core to sustainability, and why it's really exciting to talk about a panel on collaboration, is collaboration. You cannot be sustainable in isolation. So my role as director of the office is making collaborations across my city. And listening to a panel on libraries and a panel from publishers, those conversations echo each other, but not saying yes, they wouldn't have talked. But in Melbourne, quite often the publishers aren't talking to the arts organisations, or aren't talking to the libraries. So I make those collaborations happen. And collaborations across the Creative City Network and collaborations across the world. Hence why it's very interesting to be here, and what Meredith was saying about how India is such a natural destination for Australia, and has been for so long, that we've come here for a long time. And also Indians coming to Australia. Melbourne's had a doubling of Indian population in the last 4 years. So it's really core to us, and very, very important.
I was particularly attracted by the title of this panel, South-South Collaborations, because I thought for a long time that there should be a southern axis in publishing and in cultural exchange to counter the domination of our cultures from the north. I'd never thought of India, though, as part of the southern axis, because it's north to Australia. India is northwest. But I understand now that you don't have to be in the deep south, close to Antarctica, in order to think of yourself as southern. I just wanted to address 3 aspects that are really important to me as a literary publisher in Australia. The 3 features that I look out most for when I publish a book, and which I think should resonate, with the Indian situation as well. The first is language. I'm really conscious of the texture of the language of the books I publish. it's said of English that because it's the global utilitarian language, that it's really in danger of losing its richness as a creative language. And I think we have to be very conscious about that and re-enrich the language from the deprivations, the leaching out of its connotations, which have resulted from its utilitarianism, its widespread use as a language, of commerce and exchange. And so I particularly look for, I kind of have a dedication to richness, expressivity in English, which often comes from the migrant, people from migrant background in the culture, but also comes from the translation of works from other languages into English, where those translations maintain the richness of the original. The second aspect that I look out for, actually my publishing company is called Giramondo, not Geronimo, which it wouldn't be bad if it was called Geronimo. Giramondo means globetrotter in Italian. I'm really very committed to cultural diversity. Of course, and I think it's a feature of the languages of the South, of the countries of the South. And I should have said this, we're all, our literatures are all formed in relationship to a colonial language. English in the case of India and Australia, Spanish in the case of South America. So that's one reason why our languages are always kind of fighting back. But on the question of cultural diversity, Australia in the last 50 to 70 years has been washed by wave after migration, and particularly most recently from Asia. Of course, we're very young in this respect to India, which has been washed by waves of conquest and the movement of people and trade for many, many centuries. But nevertheless, it's the characteristic of both our cultures, I think, because Australia is fundamentally an immigrant culture, that it's marked by diversity. Literature has to be responsive to that, though unfortunately Australian literature still tends to be dominated by a single kind of voice and a single kind of perspective. I mean, white, middle class, essentially. And the third point I want to make, because all our countries are washed by sea, are defined by oceans, is the importance of the land, and of the land, whether it's defined by its sea boundaries or by its internal spaces, particularly the desert. Landscape's really important in Australian literature, and the relationship to the land as well. And I think that's another area in which the southern access has a stronger, even more kind of primitive sense of rootedness than those of the north. So.
To open this up fairly soon because I think part of the collaboration would be to talk to those here from South Asia. But I did have a little bit of a question for those who work or have worked in the publishing, aware of the bigger publishers. And Meredith, you're with Random House, but Terri-ann, you in fact published a celebrated translation of Uday Prakash's Walls of Delhi a few years ago. That actually he was here as it was published by Hachette here, but you were the first to publish that. But how is this being worked out within where you are? Say, Meredith alluded to a little bit the reorganization of Random House with Penguin, but talking to Shona also yesterday, how within the larger houses, which already are publishing writers in other parts of the world, how much are you looking within your own companies to see what could be brought in as part of that, and working with colleagues from other parts of the world in your own companies? So maybe you could answer that.
I don't know if this is different here, but it's actually taken quite some years to get the UK and the US to want to work particularly closely with us. They've always wanted to sell their books to us, but to actually split rights for us to buy a portion and the UK to buy a portion in the US has taken a long time. But I have actually been doing that more and more, and often it's the four of us, Canada, US, UK, and Australia, and we'll all have editorial input. Not always, sometimes, Grace Coddington, the artistic director of Vogue, I don't think anyone in any of the countries had editorial input into that. It was kind of her vision, but we all got to collaborate on various production aspects, how the book would look, how we would, when we would release it and things like that. But a lot of books we do collaborate. But I also, Thomas Keneally, who you will all know, won the Booker Prize for Schindler's Ark, which was filmed as Schindler's List. I edit him in Australia. The UK send me notes for the editions, but the original, and the US as well now. But the original edition comes from Australia. So, and that his UK publisher is Hachette, his US publisher is Simon & Schuster. So we collaborate outside the company as often as we collaborate inside the company, and are incredibly open to that. But obviously, I'd love to work with Penguin, Random House, India, as much as I would love to work with some of the other Indian publishers in the room.
Maybe one of you would say a little bit about how, as independent publishers, you also come to South Asia or other parts of the South. I don't know if you publish internationally, other writers from the South around the world, but maybe to say a little of how you get to those.
Okay. When I first started in this job, I was very keen to make a reputation, across Australia at least, and so I bought in translations. Mostly for the ANZ market. And that was just about getting the diversity of different voices, as well as having great company for my Australian writers on my list. So that felt like a good move. And then to be the originating publisher of a book translated from Hindi that then came back to India and went to the US and the UK, felt like, a very proud moment, and I'd love to do it again. Simple as that. Because I love, it's one of my favourite books that I've published. So it's about making these contacts that we're doing in our period here at Jaipur and at our time in Delhi as well, meeting Indian publishers and agents and writers and seeing what we can do. Simple as that.
I just mentioned what's possible in this area. I just happened to be publishing 3 works of fiction by Indian Australian writers this year. I mean, next year it may be completely different, but that's partly because my university is University of Western Sydney supports my publishing company, and its demographic is essentially an immigrant demographic. So it's largely, the area, Western Sydney, is largely made up of Indian, Arabic, Sudanese. Depending on where there's turbulence in the world, that's where we'll have it. But I'm also publishing a novel by a young Chinese woman writer about the Tiananmen Square massacre and its consequences, a book which can't be published in China, but which I had the money to have translated through a bequest to our university from a Chinese businessman, and through a long relationship over about 10 years between Australia and China, part of which was supported by the Australia Council. And so the possibility here is publishing books that are problematic or controversial in their own country can be brought into English and then find publishers elsewhere in the English-speaking world. I don't think Australia is often enough thought of as a conduit to the English-speaking market, and one which is in some ways more open, more tolerant, and more adventurous than the English-UK, the UK-US axis.
Actually, a reminder of that for me, was, which I recounted yesterday, was, and I've never pronounced the Chinese writer who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, Gao Xinjian, something. He is most known as a playwright when he received a Nobel, but Harper Australia was about to publish this big edition of a novel called Soul Mountain, and Harper in the US certainly was about to ignore it until that won the Nobel, and suddenly they rushed the book in. But it was one of those examples of Harper Australia being more adventuresome than its counterparts elsewhere. Wendy and David, would you say a little more maybe about some of the ways what you're doing makes overtures and connections or brings things into Australia, but also helps get Australia out in these exchanges?
As far as the Australia Council goes, we have a number of sort of arms of support. We are very conscious that we need to operate as an enabler as opposed to a director. So we will identify opportunities and then we will do things to sort of help facilitate those, but without any kind of prescription of what the outcome needs to be. So the kinds of things that we support writers to go internationally to attend festival events or so on. We support publishers to attend international trade fairs and book fairs. We support international publishers in the translation of Australian work as well. We provide funding for that. We do things like this exploratory trip where we enable publishers to go and explore new opportunities and new markets by supporting that kind of travel. We've actually just changed the way that we funded. Before we had about 156 different categories of grant. So, you know, if you were a one-armed juggler from somewhere in the Northern Territory, there was probably a grant for you that closed on one particular day of the year and so on. Now we have a very artist-driven funding model where instead of having those prescriptive categories, it's up to the artist to actually identify what they want to do, or the publisher. It's also open to publishers too. And then they're assessed by a panel of peers as to whether or not that's funded. So that I think makes it much more exciting because it turns it over to the sector and the industry to determine the kind of support that they actually need. So that means that that model became live as of the beginning of this year. So that means that we may see different trends in funding as a result, because it's now very much driven directly by the sector rather than that sort of mediated position before.
Yeah, I've got a few examples, and it's the sky's the limit. There's so many different ways we work. At the moment, we're working with the African Writers Trust in Kampala, and we've partnered them with Writers Victoria, who are our Writers Education Centre. They're running a writers group which is based in Kampala of poets, but it's being led by a poet from Melbourne, because the African Writers Trust wanted to challenge the education of their writers and have some new voices. So that's one of the projects we're working on. There's the traditional models of getting writers to writers' festivals, and one of the problems of Australia is we have a tyranny of distance. We're a long way away and it costs a lot to get anywhere. So we end up spending our whole budget sending a few people. That's why it's great we're all here. But we're certainly looking at those models and trying to also use digital models. Like we have this wonderful festival in Melbourne, which is a collection of bookshops do a rare book week. And as part of my role, I'm linking them up with Reykjavik, which is one of the cities of literature, to have a lecture about the Viking texts. So that's going to be a digital, because we couldn't afford to get the person in for a lecture for an hour, and it's not a great use of resources, but we can get all the people in Melbourne to sit in the room and expats to be there and have that engagement, and a good engagement. Another example of something that's happening in Melbourne, which I'm helping extend, is we have this program called RICE, which is Writers Immersive Cultural Exchange. And at the moment they're in Vietnam, and they have 3 Australian writers who are working with 3 Vietnamese writers in a residence. So it's not the normal residency of go somewhere, sit in a room and write and maybe do a public talk. They're actually spending a week together exchanging and engaging as writers and artists, which is really exciting. Then they do the public engagement, and then they're coming to Melbourne in time for our Melbourne Writers Festival to again have the week together and again present. And sort of part of my role in the collaboration is making sure the echoes of that is really strongly felt, and it's not just held at the Melbourne Writers Festival, it's been held in other places.
I forgot one thing which I'd also like to mention. We also, one of our, it's funny that I forgot it because it's one of the most relevant programs. So for the last 14 years, we've been running the VIP program, which is the Visiting International Publishers program. What we do is we support usually around about 12 international publishers to attend a major festival in Australia, so usually the Sydney Writers Festival or Adelaide Writers Week. They come in and spend about 10 days in Australia. They have a couple of days of lovely, if they're in Adelaide, we take them to wineries and they have a fantastic couple of days of exploring the country, and then we make them work like crazy for the next 5 days with a sort of curated series of meetings with Australian publishers. So one-on-ones, we're very careful to make sure that we sift the the applications for meetings so that they're very targeted and very focused, and their time is best utilised. They're also at one of those major events, and Sydney Writers Festival is it has a similar number of sessions to Jaipur, I suppose, and about the numbers are around 80,000 to 100,000 to attend. So, and it has a huge media profile as well. So it's a significant platform. Which enables those publishers to actually see the Australian work, and a lot of it, and that's often one of the most useful connections as well. So we now have an alumni of over 100 publishers from around the world who've participated in that program, and it's really interesting. We've had a number of Indian publishers who have as well, and it generates these long-term and really valuable connections because there's that direct knowledge. So that's an important part of our funding too.
Thank you. I think this would be a great time to open this up if anyone has, yes? Oh, you're just raising your hand?
Question two, so it helps out that I already have the microphone.
Oh, you do? Okay. It wasn't, okay.
So one of the questions is, I took a trip to the US to talk with different professors about the possibility of bringing Hindi translation over there and what the prospects are. And it seems like right now it's very poor in the United States. I think there are a lot of new great initiatives for starting up literary translation, and there are independent publishing houses, but I think as a whole we're still very far and behind in the translation scene. And I was asking, so how do we make this possible? And they say, well, it would be great if we can get a work of translation to be commercial, not just academic. Because then more people will begin to read it, and then it might actually be kind of respected on a mass scale, not within kind of small academic enclaves. But even for the academic publishers, they're very hesitant to translate works of literature or fiction because they're also focused on their own academic priorities. So that leads me to wonder, it seems like Australia is really opening up to all sorts of different types of literature from around the world, and especially translation in Hindi and in India. And I'm wondering, for these works that are published, are these commercially popular in Australia? Are lots of people reading them? And then second, speaking of collaborations for South-South, what are also the possibilities for collaboration for South-North, and having the South show the North what new types of literature exist?
Well, as far as commercial goes, my one translation from Hindi did not set the world on fire, but I did sell it to Hachette, India, and to Seven Stories for UK and US rights, and I think it's done much better for them than it did for me. But in terms of reputation, and I guess I have, as with Ivor, we've got a little bit of a buffer zone in that we have support from our institution, from our university, and we're doing good works, for in perpetuity and in a sense contributions to the culture. I can live with not having set the world on fire, but I'm really keen to keep going. I mean, I'd much rather publish a book, a translation from Hindi than a translation from a European language. Sorry, Oliver. But it's just it seems more relevant, and it also seems somewhat more innovative for our position in Asia. So. Oh well. Yeah. Ivor, do you want to add?
My question is to Wendy. First of all, thank you and congratulations for all the international programs that you're doing for publishers. Now my question is a bit similar to what John asked, but in a different way. He was talking about translations and about the market in translations. Now my question is that how and what is the prospect of Indian writers who write in English in Australia, and not only Indian, but also other countries which have writers writing in English majorly. For example, Singapore. How are these people taken? What is the readership in the market? Because they are writing in English, but of course it's Indian English, and so how is that taken in Australia? And if you have something for these people as well who are writing in English.
We do also support the funding for the creation of work as well, of course, and that's a very big chunk. So they can apply to the Australia Council for support in the writing of that book. In terms, it actually might be a question more for Ivor as well, given the kind of complexion of his list, because he does publish a lot of migrant authors who come in, and there certainly is. Both Meredith and I are former directors of Sydney Writers Festival. We're part of a very small elite group. I think there's 5 of us in the world, but it's always been there is an enormous appetite, certainly in a festival context, for work. For that kind of work as well, because Australia is such, the blend of cultures is significant, and in Sydney, in particular, in Western Sydney, there is a massive richness of cultures from South Asia and the Middle East and a whole raft of different cultural groups. So there's a number of arts organisations who specifically work with those artists and enable that work to see the light of day, and we fund them too. So it's kind of a many faceted approach. But Ivor, you might want to talk a bit more about the kinds of titles that you have published.
I'm supported by a university like Terri-ann, so the sales figures are irrelevant, really. The main thing is to get the book out there, because we've got a whole kind of context which supports the publishing and the reception of the book. Symposia, conferences, visiting, writers in residence, often in conjunction with writers' festivals and other groups. So, but your question was actually a really interesting one. It's not just about writers of, say, Singaporean extraction who are living in Australia, and I have published one, but you're actually saying, to what extent can Australia act as a host for writers of English in other countries? And there I think we have got a real role, which is played partly at an academic level at the moment, but I think the Australia Council, which has only recently recognised the importance of reciprocity, now needs to take the next step, or in the next 10 years, and to recognise that Australia actually has this larger international function in relation to English language. I think that's a really good point.
I have a comment and then a question. The comment is basically, I don't know to what extent you realize how many Australian teachers there are in India teaching IB. And the imports into India from Australia are probably entirely educational books from 2 publishers. One is called IBID and other is called Hayes and Hawes, mathematics publisher, education publisher from Adelaide, which sell very well. But these are all IB educational books. Your other books are actually difficult to import because there is no quantity, and it has to be imported from UK because your freight is your biggest issue so far. Now, to what extent will override that freight question? E-books. I believe you are becoming sort of market leaders in the digital publishing scene, because so much of because it's such a large country, and your internal freight must be enormous. Therefore, I was told that is developing, one of the fastest developing is in Australia. So that's my question, is basically, is selling more than printed books in fiction and popular non-fiction?
Like in like the UK and the US, ebook sales have plateaued. In Australia, that growth has slowed right down, and it's hit about 20%. Who knows what might come along and give it another boot to leap up again, but right now it's sitting at about 20%. It's, because I publish predominantly literary fiction and non-fiction, and I grew up in a regional area of Australia, I've never been afraid of the ebook, and I don't think of it as a challenge to the print book. I think there are books I personally like to read on paper, but I'm just incredibly pleased that bookstores are available to people living anywhere, because Australia is a large country and there aren't bookstores in lots of places where people want to read. If people can get access to books, they will read. So I'm thrilled that we are selling ebooks, and certainly everything that I publish has been published simultaneously as an ebook for a good 5 years now, and we have all of our backlist in ebooks now, which is incredibly exciting as well, I think. I just want books to be available in any possible way. Obviously, the price of books in Australia, if any of you know how much they cost, anyone I've spoken to in the week we've been here so far, they look at the price of Indian books and they look at the price of Australian books, they go, oh my God, you know. It makes sense to us that they're the price they are, you know, the unit costs are much more expensive in Australia, and we have a really tiny population as well, so, and we are trying to publish across an enormous range. But you're absolutely right, I was trying to learn about our relationship with India and our publishing, and we don't export to India because we can't make the freight work. We just can't possibly make that work. We're exporting to a lot of Asian countries, and certainly when we buy rights to a book now, when we publish a book, we are fighting to get us access to as many countries as we can. You know, we used to just get Australia, New Zealand rights, and now we're pushing for Oceania, Australia and Asia and all that kind of stuff, because we want to be able to publish it, be it as an ebook or a print book as well. But yeah, I think the ebook is making things much more possible for us at the moment.
Just as a comparison, and Ivor might want to add to this as well, but as a small publisher, as opposed to the 20% ebooks, we've just had a bit of a surge in 2014 to about 2.5%. So and we've been in the market for about 5 years as well. So that's pretty interesting, I think.
It's kind of genre-based as well, because the biggest genre in ebooks for us is women's fiction. I call it fiction with a cowboy hat on the cover, you know, kind of romance and out in rural Australia and stuff. Not just about love by any means, about the power of women surviving in different environments and women's story, but that's our largest genre.
Most of my ebook sales are to overseas. Most of my ebook sales are to overseas readers of our overseas books, of our books that come from overseas authors, and then they don't have to pay freight, and it's half the price. So for us, it's been really beneficial because it's cancelled out the freight cost altogether. It means that we now can have international distribution, admittedly only electronic, but it's a big development.
Will it be the case that talking about South-South collaboration, it should be in E?
Yeah, I agree.
I think Sean is going to add.
Hi. I think the other opportunity is actually print on demand and printing here in India. You've obviously got a very fabulous printing industry. One of the things that HarperCollins is just doing around the world is we've got a Harper 360 program, which is seeing books from all countries being distributed. India and Australia have been the recipients of distributed books from the UK and the US for a very long time, but now we actually are in all those countries sending our own books back. But part of that is actually sending files. So if there's a possibility to do 500 copies here, don't put them on a ship. We can just send the files and they can be printed here. And I think more than actually print on demand, which we can do in very small quantities, offers a real opportunity for books coming both ways. I think certainly opportunities for Indian books coming into Australia, where obviously there is a big community, and also in New Zealand, very big Indian community in parts of Auckland, that's another way that we can bridge that gap.
I think choose you, Ryding.
Thank you. This is just to continue from where Terri-ann left. One-off book in translation may not have left an impact, but it definitely, helped you talk about a certain kind of literature in your language. I think what really helps in such scenarios is to go for bulk deals. take more books from a single author and then establish that author into the language. That's what we try to do with Herta Müller, and trust me, with 5 books, Adam Schaukel, and I can't pronounce the right German pronunciation, and I'm not going to embarrass my German friends here with the bad ones, but they've really done well, and it really helps us talk about the books in edits, in press, with a larger content to our disposal. So I think it would really help you to look at the complete circle, instead of one book at a time, because it will just get lost in the gamut of books that are there on the bookshelves anyways. So.
Yeah, I'd like to first ask Ivor, the 4 Indian Australian writers whom you've published this year, were their novels set in Australia or in India or elsewhere? Okay. Well, that's certainly heartening to know, and also to have heard Terri say that she published a Hindi translation of a Hindi work, because one of the problems that has always been there in, whenever it's a question of having a real two-way process where books from Australia or the UK or the US are published in India, and it just doesn't happen in the other direction, because that is largely because, as far as at least the English reading public in India is much more exposed to the West or the South, if you're referring to Australia, thanks to, television, international travel, and of course our colonial background where our education system was shaped by the British. So it's much easier for a reader in English in India to connect with what is happening in a novel which is set even in Australia, and certainly more so UK or US, than it is for your readers to connect with what one would call an Indian novel. And that is a problem which I think all publishers here have had over the years, where we have happily bought books from you, but when we try to sell rights to you, then we're always told, oh, it's too Indian a novel, or this content really wouldn't translate to most of our readers. So if this is at least beginning to happen now, even if it has to be facilitated with university grants, then that's certainly a good, a step in the right direction.
I'd just like to add to that. I think it's not an issue related only to literature, but to the arts generally. Australia has historically been seen as a closed shop to many, so quite good at putting the work out there, but not so good at actually taking the work back in. But in the last 5 years in particular, that has really started to change, and there's been a couple of people who've been quite evangelical in championing what needs to be happening to turn that situation around. So, for example, we have the Asia Pacific Triennial of Art, which has really mainstreamed for visual arts the presentation of visual arts from Asia in Australia, and the same thing is happening in the performing arts. And often it comes from philanthropy as well. So Sydney Meyer, who's a private philanthropy trust in Australia, has just injected $2 million into the Asia Pacific Performing Arts Triennial, and the sole purpose of that is to make the presentation and experience of Asian art in Australia a mainstream experience rather than something that is restricted to a certain few aficionados. So the tide is turning, and we certainly see that in the research that we're doing as well. And also the artists themselves have started to shift their focus very much so, and that all those things mean that the world is changing, so hopefully it will be better soon.
Hi, I'm glad that you touched on POD. That's my area of expertise, and not in India yet. Not yet, but what I'm interested in is that there is a real connection in the academic publishing side between professors in India who've gone over to teach in Australia. They find that the titles that they've worked on are that they're not available in Australia. And so looking to make those available in Australia via POD so that they can teach those titles on their courses is really important. And I think going the other way as well, I've got publishers I work with, Orient Black Swan being one of them. They've got about 30% of their list of their titles who are written by Australian professors. And so sort of going the other way, we need to make sure that there's a kind of reciprocal availability of those titles. So good to see that it's on everyone's agenda.
I think building on the question that you asked about Australians being interested in Indian literature, is it actually about how a book is written? So how are writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Vikram Seth, who are contemporary icons, taken in Australia, and what's been the market for them?
They've been as successful as obviously the numbers aren't the same as in the US, but proportionately they've been very successful. And that's what I was thinking when you were saying that. In fact, the awareness of Indian writing in Australia, I'm sure, is more substantial than Australian writing in India, because they have, Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, there are so many names, Anita Desai, big prize-winning novels with global awareness, we will buy. We're very influenced by US reading lists.
So how it is written is as important as what is written. People will read everything, I think.
Yeah, I found that, she's gone, the woman who was here earlier who asked a question about Indian English. Midnight's, Salman Rushdie, Midnight's Children, obviously, is not something that you can leap into and read. I'm reading The Lives of Others at the moment, the Neil Mukherjee, and, it has a glossary in the back to help the reader and things. We are influenced, we read from many, many countries because we are a tiny Commonwealth country, and books landed on our shores for years before we had our own publishing industry.
Thank you.
I think the real challenge probably is not works that were originally written in English by Indian authors, but works that were written in other Indian languages.
Ivor, use the microphone.
Because our access to them is very, very limited.
I think the other thing that's worth noting is that Australia is very much a country of writers' festivals as well. We have more writers' festivals than India, I realise, has a lot too, but this has been a very established tradition. Every state and territory has its own writers' festival of various sizes, and they're big events, and when they happen, you can introduce a writer as a festival director who isn't known, and you can put them into that platform, and you will actually, you have a very unique position as a tastemaker by doing that. So, and you will find that in that festival context, people are willing to experiment, because many, like Jaipur, many of the events in a lot of those festivals are free, so you have a wide remit. So that's a very important way of shaping, I think, the readership for a book, if it can be put onto a festival platform.
Hello, just another comment from me. Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake is actually set as part of the advanced English course for our highest school certificate, which is the most, senior level, really on the topic of belonging. But I think the point is that a lot of those significant authors have come to us in Australia through the filter of being signed up for global, international deals. And the challenge that we have is trying to find people ourselves to publish, not waiting for the endorsement of colleagues in New York or London or big deals.
No, it was the same point as you made, really, that it's the same situation in Norway. Indian writers are very much read and very well known and very much loved, but almost all of them are the ones who write in English. And the trouble is to reach those who write in Indian languages. I'm sure there's a world out there that needs to be discovered, and people are waiting for it. So please give them to us.
Yeah, just to comment on the Indian English as well. I mean, when the English language is preserved here in a way that it isn't, elsewhere in the world, in England or in America, where they speak American, and I think that some of the writing that I've seen, a lot of the writing I've seen from India and the subcontinent, it's very densely written. It's very rich and very dense. It doesn't have that. A lot of the times, it doesn't have space an air and lightness in it that allows the reader in, and really complex language and complex vocabulary that isn't really in use any longer in the UK and the USA, unfortunately. And I think there's that sometimes, I have a few authors on my books that say to me, look, this novel is not, I didn't write this novel for the international market, I wrote this novel for India, or I wrote this novel for Bangladesh. But go and see if you can sell it to the UK and the USA. I'm like, well, so they are aware when they're writing of who their audience is. And it isn't that they have slang or idiomatic language, it's just that the subject matter is so unfamiliar and it's so for a particular audience that, it's very difficult to make it appeal to an audience outside this country.
I'll respond to that. I think it's not just an Indian issue. Is Junot Diaz popular here? I think he won a Pulitzer. I just saw he's just been voted. His novel, The Brief Lives of Oscar Wilde, has just been voted as one of the most popular books of the last decade and a half or something in the US. He writes in a lot of Dominican jargon. It is, and some of, if I think about Alexis Wright Carpentaria, an Australian novel that's been translated here, we publish lots of books that are dense or in language that is not the language we speak every day or the language we read in the newspaper. So it's about voice and resonance and story and the passion of the thing. We are an open audience, but the breakthrough is difficult, and discoverability that we were talking about earlier is difficult as well. But it's not a major impediment. It's that connecting with the reader is the really big important thing.
Maybe one more? We have time for it, or are we there? So if we're there, we'll conclude this lively this morning. It's not an evening yet. And say thank you, thank our panelists, and thank you all, and I think it's time for lunch.